Minasan Yokoso. Hello and welcome everyone. This is Joshua Walker from Japan Society. We are excited to bring you Nichibei Global Talks, our latest resource for U.S. and Japanese perspectives on topics of global relevance that affect both countries and test their global leadership. Many of us expect the United States and Japan, the world's first and the third largest economies, to lead global progress on many common goals and challenges, and to lead them with values. In this series, we take a deeper look at each country's unique circumstances and experiences in addressing these common goals and challenges, draw lessons learned and best practices, and explore areas for greater U.S.-Japan coordination and collaboration. We hope the series gives you greater insights into global topics that matter to all of us, whether you're here in the United States, in Japan, or elsewhere in the world. Thank you for watching. Dozo yoroshiku onegai itashimasu. Today, we welcome Miho Kurosaki from BloombergNEF and Paul Bodnar from Rocky Mountain Institute, two experts with a lot of experience looking at energy and climate change from the private and public sector. Thank you, Paul and Miho, for joining us in this series. Let's start with the broader global energy outlook. Paul, you served in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the National Security Council. There's been a lot of change since then, and the Paris Climate Accord of 2015, including a change in the U.S. administration. What does the global outlook look like from your perspective?
Thanks, Joshua. A pleasure to be with you today. So as you say, there has been a lot of progress globally on the topic of clean energy and climate action in the last few years, even though global political headwinds have definitely slowed things down. Particularly, the evolution of clean energy costs has continued to plummet and made them much more competitive, clean energy technologies, than they were even 5 years ago compared to traditional fossil technologies like coal and increasingly natural gas. The problem, however, is that speed is of the essence. Every year that we don't transform our economies to clean energy, we accumulate gases, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and decrease the chance that we'll be able to avoid dangerous climate change. So although the direction of travel is positive, in many important sectors of the global economy, power generation, transportation, and electric vehicles, even in industrial sectors, the question is, are we moving fast enough? And the answer is, generally speaking, no, we're not. And there are bright spots in different regions and different sectors, but we're in a situation where if we want to have a hope of avoiding the most dangerous impacts of climate change, we need to cut global emissions by 50% approximately by 2030. And that is a very daunting prospect. It's not enough to just look at how fast the clean green stuff is getting built out. What you need to look at is how fast are we replacing the things that actually emit greenhouse gases, right? So how fast are we retiring the fleet of coal-fired power plants? How fast are we taking the cars off the road whose emissions are inconsistent with climate objectives? And that's really the key indicator, is the rate at which we're transforming the economy to continue to allow us to develop and produce the services that people want, but to scrub the emissions out. So you have to look at both the clean, happy, green side and the not so easy, dirty side, and see how fast both are moving.
Miho, you have advised the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a committee member of their Climate Change Advisory Panel and the Japanese Ministry of Environment on coal export policy. What does the global outlook look like to you?
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you for having me today. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, if you look at that number, unfortunately, the progress has not much made in the past few years. So greenhouse gas has reached a record high in 2018, according to United Nations Environmental Program. Also, global average concentration of carbon dioxide has reached the record again, over 407 parts per million, so ppm in 2018 as well. But the good news, I would like to echo what Paul said, is that the power sector managed to lower its emission thanks to cheap and competitive renewable energy. The sector accounts for a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, renewable energy became the cheapest source of generation as a new build basis in the 2/3 of the world's economy. However, other sectors, such as industry, transport, buildings, Paul also mentioned those sectors, have increased its emissions, and these sectors are very difficult to decarbonize. So why I'm bringing up these sectors is because they have high heat requirements. That means they use fossil fuels as feedstocks. So it's very difficult to electrify their manufacturing process with a possible decarbonizing solutions such as renewable energy or switching fuels with biogas. However, the good news is that a lot of Japanese governments or global countries have a higher interest in hydrogen. So hydrogen can play a major role in decarbonizing industrial process and transportation. And we think renewable source hydrogen will be competitive with fossil fuel derived hydrogen by 2050. It's quite a long time, but thanks to, it's thanks to lowering costs of renewable energy.
So the two useful ways to think about this, perhaps, if you don't spend all your time worrying about energy as Miho and I do, is that we have the opportunity to electrify as much of the economy as possible and then clean the grid that's producing electricity. So those two processes, which is to convert as much as we can to electricity in terms of where energy is coming from, and then clean the electricity supply, that can get us a very big part of the way there on the climate problem. And then we're going to be in a situation where right now, the big change that's happening is to convert from fossil to clean electricity. Those heavy industries that Miho mentioned are going to be battling over whether they're using hydrocarbons or electricity. And so those are some of the macro changes that we're going to be tracking in the coming years to see if we're making fast enough progress.
Paul, this is an election year in the United States. Do you actually think that the presidential election will affect U.S. climate change policy after 2020?
You're absolutely right that this is a critical election year for us, and it's been an interesting period in the last 4 years on energy policy in the United States. On the one hand, of course, we have a federal administration that has decided largely to ignore the climate problem and to invest in the continuation of fossil energy, or at least try to do so. And yet the market has been pushing back quite strongly. So the pace of retirement of coal-fired power plants in the United States has actually accelerated during the Trump administration relative to beforehand. And that's largely because in a lot of the country, market forces are pushing coal out relative to clean energy as it becomes more competitive. Now, the problem is that a lot of the coal generation in the United States and actually worldwide is not necessarily subject to free competition from renewable energy because it's governed by long-term contracts and tariffs that make it harder to just switch when a new source of energy becomes cheaper, like wind or solar. But when you look at it, we just did some new analysis that shows that if you look at the entire remaining US coal-fired fleet, which is about 240 gigawatts, so much of it is uncompetitive right now that you could retire the entire US coal fleet and replace it with clean energy, including storage, at a net savings of $9 billion a year for energy, for consumers of energy, ordinary consumers of energy. And so no matter what the policy world is doing, really that has reached such a tipping point that you will see the end of coal in the United States. So I think what you're seeing is a tension between the federal policy world and markets, at least in the power sector, and to some extent also in the transportation sector. And what's been interesting to observe is that the absence of the US federal government on the international scene, the decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, there has been a gap. That gap has been filled by US states and cities and businesses who have formed a coalition called We Are Still In, that has very powerfully made the point that the federal government alone does not control the direction of US climate action. It's not like a big on-off switch that the president gets to pull. And so if you look at the states and cities that have committed to the Paris Agreement, they represent almost 2/3 of all Americans. So almost 2/3 of all Americans live in a city or state that continues to move forward. And what we've learned during this period is that it's not a question of federal policy or state and local policy. You need both in order to move fast enough to make the progress we need to make. And so that is what hopefully will happen starting next year.
Miho, Japan is a country prone to so many natural disasters, which seem to be on the rise recently due to climate change. It's also an island nation without some of the natural resources that the United States has been blessed with. How do these factors affect Japan's energy investment decisions?
Thank you, Josh. So indeed, Japan is very, very vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters such as earthquake and typhoon. Country has done a major energy overhaul in the aftermath of Great Eastern Earthquake and Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. And it has decided to take a balanced portfolio approach. So not too much rely on one technology, such as we did to oil in the 1970s, and not too much rely on nuclear. And we learned the lessons from the oil shocks and nuclear accident in 2011. And then the generous feed-in tariff scheme kicked in 2012 and has boosted investments in solar projects. At the same time, as a resource poor country, as you correctly pointed out, Japan has also increased fossil fuel imports at the expense of nuclear generation. I would like to tell you a little bit more a recent and good story that is distributed energy, such as rooftop solar and small-scale batteries, has been increasing popular in Japan. One of the big reasons is quite related to what Paul mentioned, is the growing number of Japanese corporations signing up to global sustainability initiatives such as RE100 or Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. They want to procure renewable energy. And those companies are also looking for clean energy options, but also making sure to keep energy resiliency to tackle natural disasters and climate change. Currently, Japan's generation is coming from 40% from gas, 30% from coal, and 8 to 9% from solar and hydro respectively, and then nuclear accounts for 6%. And we expect the largest capacity addition is coming from solar this year, about 7 gigawatt. It's actually surprisingly big number despite the COVID-19 impacts. And in fact, the cumulative solar capacity became the largest technology last year, surpassed gas. On the other hand, as I pointed out, we expect coal will become the largest generation in 2022, as Japan is currently building 5 gigawatt of new coal capacity by that year, so 2022. When the government reviews the 2030 target, I really hope that they will materialize the policy that stated the renewable energy source can become the main source of generation. So that is stated in the last basic energy policy in 2018.
You both mentioned the impact that COVID-19 has had. We've learned that global CO2 emissions fell to levels not seen since 2006. In April, global CO2 emissions were 17% lower than last year. What can COVID-19 teach us about tackling global climate change? Starting with you, Paul.
I think that to some extent, you could say that we've won a little time and a little breathing room for ourselves with COVID. But the question is whether we will simply bounce back linearly with economic activity, or whether we can take this opportunity to build back differently. Right? And that the economy we are trying to rebuild is not the same one that we were trying to decarbonize earlier. And there are opportunities there in terms of stimulus funding and the way that stimulus funding is used to accelerate that transition or not. So, and of course, governments who are doing quantitative easing and other policies will effectively end up owning more of the economy, or having more of the economy on the state balance sheet, which again presents an opportunity. So the question is really one of leadership, and whether national policymakers who are trying to put out the COVID fire can have the foresight to do so in ways that hasten the clean energy transition, because just relying on the dip in emissions that we've seen is probably not going to do it.
Thank you. Miho, has COVID-19 had the same impact in Japan? And do you agree with what Paul just laid out?
I think, yeah, definitely, I agree with what Paul said. But it's all great news that we've seen a lot of cities that suffered air pollution in the past can now see the clear blue skies after the pandemic and slow down economy. However, I again would like to emphasize that climate change still continues, as I said in the beginning, and it's because it's a result of what we have done in the past. It's just irreversible. And in fact, we saw in Japan very warm winter, very warm spring compared to past years, and heavy rain and prolonged rainy season. It's supposed to be ending rainy season now, but it's continuing at a very unprecedented level this year. And scientists in Japan are saying that climate change is one of the major factors to these phenomena. And we really need to think about economy and green recovery, as Paul mentioned, at the same time. The pandemic is a very awful thing, but we can turn this into an opportunity. In fact, many CEOs in Japan and globally have expressed that they will rethink, redesign, and rebuild supply chain. Also, tech giants such as Apple and Microsoft recently has revealed more aggressive sustainability strategy to procure 100% renewable products for Apple or become a net zero carbon company for Microsoft. So economy and business will need to really think about how to achieve both economic and sustainable development under this pandemic. As Japan holds many supply chain companies for these tech giants, business competition to become sustainable company gets very intensified in order for them to not to lose its businesses with these companies.
Thank you, Miho. I now want to take this conversation home to a conversation about U.S.-Japan cooperation in terms of battling global climate change. Are there areas in which we can cooperate both in the private sector and in the public sector? Paul, can we start with you?
Certainly, and I had the pleasure to be involved in probably the highest stakes or highest profile area of U.S.-Japan cooperation on climate change during the Obama administration, which actually started out as an area of disagreement. Namely, we've talked here about what Japan and the United States need to do domestically to reduce their emissions. But of course, each country plays an important role in financing and supplying technology to other countries. And so the US and Japan have traditionally both been very important markets or sources of technology in the power generation sector. And historically, both have supplied quite a lot of coal-fired power to other countries, often backed by our respective public export credit agencies. And so a few years ago, there started to be a big global debate about whether this was a good idea or not. And initially, the US and Japan disagreed on this topic. And I remember many frosty discussions between Prime Minister Abe and President Obama on this subject. And, Japan had a very rational and clear view, which was that countries set their own technology goals for the energy sector. And so if a country has decided that it wants to build 30% coal, then Japan should sell that country the most efficient form of coal that it can. And that would actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to less efficient or dirtier coal technologies. And our view was, well, the availability of financing for those technologies actually affects the choices that countries make in the first place, and they're not sort of rigidly attached to coal versus gas versus renewables or nuclear. And so we managed to actually forge a bilateral agreement between the US and Japan on the question of how export credit agencies support these technology exports. And we took that agreement and made it into a multilateral agreement in the context of the OECD. And that was a real breakthrough in this sector. And it was brokered by the US and Japan together. And so what that story shows, I think, is that even in areas where we might disagree at first, it is very important to have the dialogue to really understand each other's perspectives. And we can not only resolve those perspectives, but to work together to get other countries on board and make progress. And so when we look forward, obviously there continues to be some debate about the export of coal-fired power, and I know that's an area of significant movement today in Japanese policy. But when we look at other opportunities to cooperate on the development of technology or creating markets for technology, there's so much we can do together, and it is so important for the US and Japan to be working together in the global context.
Miho, same question to you. The question of coal in Japan generates a lot of interest in the US. Environment Minister Koizumi recently announced that Japan would tighten its export criteria for coal-fired power plants. Can the United States and Japan work closer together to stop global warming? Where do you see US and Japan cooperation in the long term, and do you see better cooperation in the future, as Paul has just laid out?
Thank you. I think I agree what Paul said, but I would say it could be a few areas. First is to strengthen what Paul mentioned about the OECD export financing guidelines. I think maybe US and Japan can cooperate together to limit funding to zero carbon technology. Could be maybe advanced coal technology, but we should consider putting CCUS or CCS together for the funding requirements to really decarbonize developed, but also developing countries too. And I really think that related to this, Japan and US can partner to develop funding, but also knowledge sharing platform for emerging economies. This was discussed and recommended to Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan in 2018 when I was serving as a committee member for the advisory panel on climate change. And I think developing countries definitely is catching up on the energy policy, but also we can transfer some of the knowledge in terms of financing clean technology and also basic understanding of technology itself. And then I again would like to echo what Paul said, more cooperation and collaboration between JBIC, JICA, and their counterparts in the US can enable both countries to counter, for example, China's financial power in Southeast Asian countries. And, you know, as you correctly mentioned, infrastructure export policy that was announced on July 10th, the new coal plant export policy looks as if, as Minister Koizumi said, that it will curb coal technology, but in our opinion, it's really up to how you interpret. So in fact, he says it will curb the coal technology, but again, he put it a magic word. It's called in principle. So in principle, Japan doesn't export coal technology, but in principle means that you can also include a few other conditions. That is, you can actually export coal technology such as ultra supercritical technology that has higher efficiency than 43%. So, but again, he also correctly mentioned that market doesn't really allow coal export anymore. For example, big three mega banks, large banks, Japanese banks in Japan, such as MUFJ, Mizuho, SMBC, have a very, very strict coal export policy or coal financing policy that they are not anymore allowing new coal financing for the new build. So again, the situation has been changing. So it's a very, very good news on the financing side. And then again, I would like to echo what Paul said is on the partnership on the R&D side. It's really scale up the technologies for how to decarbonize sectors, as I mentioned previously, such as steel and iron, cement, or chemical industries. And I think hydrogen, a basic technology, or R&D cooperation will be a great area for Japan and US to collaborate.
I definitely learned something new today. Thank you both. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with the audience in closing as we wrap up?
Just to say that I think our societies are facing the same global challenge here. And to some extent, whether we succeed or fail will be determined in the next few years with massive global consequences. And so we need to have the same mentality individually in the United States and Japan, but also the way we think about working together, that we do when we're facing a very serious and immediate social problem, right? Whether you call that a wartime mentality or something else, we need to bring the same degree of focus and collaborative spirit, because if the decisions we make between now and 2030 are going to have consequences for many generations to come, and there are fewer than 2,500 working days between now and 2030.
According to our analysis, we concluded that even with the cheap and competitive renewable energy, the world will miss the 2-degree pathways. So even if we accelerate renewable energy additions in global economy, we won't be able to curb the emissions. So we really, really need to think about the second generation of decarbonizing technology, such as I mentioned, hydrogen or biogas and so on. If we are not serious about the climate change, we simply lose the clean air or the temperature or the weather we have seen in our childhood or nowadays that we cannot carry over to our children. So the world or economy or individuals or businesses, now is the time to really think about the climate change seriously.
いかがでしたか? We hope you enjoyed this Nichibei Global Talks. Paul and Miho gave us a lot to think about. Here are my takeaways. Clearly, the decisions we make between now and 2030 will have massive consequences for future generations. There's been a lot of progress, particularly on clean energy and climate action, as we discussed in the last few years. But the speed is really essential. In the U.S., both federal and state policies need to support combating climate change. And in both the United States and Japan, the private sector is key and will be a strong force driver behind much progress in both countries. Clearly, with the global pandemic of COVID-19, it may have bought us a little bit of essential time and an opportunity to rebuild a new economy that's more climate friendly. But we'll see. We touched on several areas for U.S.-Japan cooperation, like an R&D on new technologies, as countries supplying technologies to other countries in the power generation sector. It's important for the U.S. and Japan to work together on export and financing policies to help other countries decarbonize. Thank you again for joining us. Please subscribe to our social media channels, follow us on social media, and stay connected. We hope to see you soon. Mata oai shimashou.